So we're here today with Behan, excuse me. And we're so thrilled to have Bev here with us today to talk about becoming a boardroom star, one of my very favorite topics. Bev has advised nearly 200 boards around the world on a range of board effectiveness over the last 25 years. She primarily works with the boards of public companies trading on the New York Stock Exchange and the NASDAQ, but she's also worked with private companies, a few boards of government-controlled entities, and several nonprofit boards as well throughout her career. And her career has truly been global. She's worked with boards in US, Canada, the Middle East, Asia, and Latin America. Bev is the author of Great Companies Deserve Great Boards, which was named Governance Book of the Year and has long been considered a corporate governance classic. Her latest book, Board and Director Evaluations, Innovations for 21st Century Governance Committees, came out about 5 weeks ago and debuted as the #1 release in corporate governance on Amazon worldwide. Go Bev! The book we're going to be focusing on today is Becoming a Boardroom Star, which is currently available on Amazon in pre-order, and it's scheduled to launch at the end of September. So that is Bev, who we are so lucky to have with us here today. And most of you know me already. Cynthia Remec, I'm the executive director and founder of nonprofit BoardAssist. And as you know, what we do is we're the leading personalized nonprofit board matching service in the country, having brought over $155 million into the nonprofit community over the last 20 years. We would love to work with anybody who has joined us today or any of your friends who are interested in nonprofit board service. We have boards for all of you. We would love to help. And as a nonprofit, there's never a fee for candidates to work with BoardAssist. So because we know you are all very busy people, we're going to dive right in and put Bev to work and start asking her, how are we going to all become boardroom stars? So Bev, tell us a little bit about becoming a boardroom star. What's the book about and what was your motivation in writing it?
Well, Cynthia, thank you so much for giving me the privilege of speaking to BoardAssist and working with you today. I so commend all the great work that you do in placing people on nonprofit boards, because I think that's a great first board experience for so many people. So I just want to sort of shout that out. As you mentioned, I've worked with boards, almost 200 boards now. And in a lot of my work, it involves board evaluations and director evaluations, and they're all done by interview when I do them, because I find that's the only methodology that really provides the kind of constructive feedback that is valuable. So I've interviewed thousands, literally, of directors over the last 25 years in confidence about what makes someone really shine in the boardroom, earning the genuine respect of their peers, the management team, adding real value for the organization. And at the same time, I've collected feedback from thousands of directors about, what are the things that have detracted from a director's performance? What are the things that are common pitfalls? And the board really emerged, the book, Boardroom Star, really emerged from those conversations. I felt it was important. Why I think my impetus for writing it right at the moment was that we have seen so much interesting recruitment over the last, I would say, year and a half, with so many diversity candidates going onto boards. There's 400 new directors have gone onto the boards of the Fortune 500 alone. And many of them are women and people of color. And I have so many friends who are women and people of color. And they said, I'm going on my first board and I want to hit it out of the park. What do I do? And I wrote the book sort of for them. And it's really interesting because Heidrick & Struggles just released their US board monitor. And again, this is in the for-profit world. Nearly 40% of the new directors going on to the Fortune 500 boards have never been on a board before. So becoming a boardroom star is really something to give you the insights from thousands of directors that can help you to make that transition and be successful in the boardroom.
That's so great. And when people come to BoardAssist looking for a board, everybody who comes to us wants to be a boardroom star. Nobody is coming on a board because they just want to write a check. They're coming on a board because they want to be an agent of change. And so this is like this book coming out. There's such a need for it, and I know it's going to be super successful. So you're not an executive coach, you're not a headhunter, you're a board effectiveness expert. How did you develop the ideas that we'll find in the new book?
Well, as I mentioned earlier, Cynthia, those really came from the conversations that I would have in director evaluations, board evaluations, and, having talked to really thousands of board members, not just in the United States, but, what's really interesting, I sent a copy of Boardroom Star. I did a fair bit of work in Malaysia. I did work with a company called Sime Darby, which is a huge conglomerate. I did some other work over there, and I sent a couple of copies of Boardroom Star over to people in Kuala Lumpur. And they all got back to me and said, I was laughing so hard at some of the examples in the book because I've seen exactly this in my boardroom in Kuala Lumpur. And my client in Israel said, I totally know what happened with this guy. And, there's a guy I've done work with in Medellin, Colombia. And he's like, I love this one example about the lead director that has to take out this really underperforming board members. So my point is, the anecdotes and the stories, they're universal. This is the kind of stuff that's happening in boardrooms all over the world. And so I think it has a global application.
I completely agree. And I know everybody who's tuning in is super excited to yes, let's get to the meat of it. Let's hear all these things you know. So the book has insights for new directors to longer serving board members. And even a section on being highly effective as a committee chair and as the chair of the board. So let's talk about each of these stages in someone's board career. Let's start with the new directors. What do they really need to focus on?
So the first thing they need to focus on is getting to learn the organization that they're governing. Okay. So in the nonprofit world, a lot of people start off as volunteers or things like that. And I actually find that a lot of nonprofit organizations do not have great orientation programs. They almost assume that the people coming on their board must know the organization. Well, they'll know a certain slice of the organization. And I think that's an area for improvement. So this book is not about, board building. That's a whole other topic about improving your orientation program. If you're an individual director, you come on a nonprofit board, it's kind of a here's your binder and show up next week type of orientation. What you should think about is what could you do on your own to learn a little bit more right out of the gates about the business or about the organization. Okay. Should you maybe meet with the people in the finance group? Is there a part of the fundraising activity you really don't know that much that you want to learn a little bit about? So my first piece of advice is to use that sort of newbie status to reach out. You don't want to become, a prima donna, and you have to realize every time you might ask for a particular session, you're taking up somebody's time to do that. But I think it's very fair game, and I think it stands you in very good stead. And I'd elaborate on that a little bit more because this is really something from, I would say, the for-profit world, but it also applies to the nonprofit world, which is this. Very often you're brought onto a board because of something specific in your background, okay? Maybe it's that you're a finance wizard. Maybe it's that you're a tech guru. Maybe it's that you're a brand marketing expert, okay? And the board expects you to weigh in on your area of expertise when that comes up in the meeting. So one of the things you want to do early on in your orientation, in your first sort of year on the organization, spend a little bit of time with the people in that area and find out what's going on so that you have a really good grounding. That's why when you go to weigh in the board meeting or the committee meeting, you've got the context of what they're actually doing. And it's amazing to me how few people really do that. And I think it's going to make a huge difference. So those would be some advice for new directors.
Bev, you've touched on a bunch of things that we talk about a lot at BoardAssist that I'm so glad you flagged. One that, oftentimes we'll speak with somebody we placed on a board and they'll be bemoaning the fact that there wasn't more of an orientation. But I like what you said, which is that you don't need to wait. If there isn't an orientation, first of all, you as the new director may raise your hand and say, let's have an orientation program for new, and I'll be the board member that's going to put that in place. That's a problem our organization has. I'll raise my hand and I'll be the one who's going to put that in place. another thing about, talking as a board member with individual staff members, in the nonprofit world, this is a bit of a touchy subject in that executive directors don't want board members reaching out to
Right.
staff members directly. But there is nothing wrong with going through the executive director and saying, hey, I'm the finance person. I'd love to talk to some of the people in the finance department. And with the executive director partnering with you, starting those conversations. So that's such a great recommendation. And then the last thing that it made me think of is that, we talk about this a lot when we're talking to people we've placed on boards, is this idea that you've built this relationship with the people in the department that you'll be opining on. It really matters a lot because you're building a consensus. So when you want to get something accomplished, these people they will not see you as a threat. They will see you as a partner because you've been partnering with them all along. And so it lets you be so much more effective. So I love that you brought all those things up.
Can I just say, I'd just like to underscore, I think it's a very good point that you brought up, Cynthia, which is you always want to observe what I'll call the board management protocol about reaching out to people under the executive director level. And I'm really glad you brought that out. If you want to have some of those meetings, you should definitely be going through the executive director. You don't want to start calling people up randomly because then, there's going to be some blowback. So I'm really glad that you mentioned that. I think that's really important.
Well, thank you. So I'm a new director who's never been on a board before. Is there anything I need to be particularly aware of or conscious of to make a smooth transition?
So the biggest challenge for any director, and I think this is true in any board, okay, is transitioning from management to governance, right? It's almost natural. We see it all the time in the S&P 1500, but you'll see it in the nonprofit world. You'll see it even on private company boards, family company boards. People are high-powered executives. They join a board, and it's very natural to just sit down at the board table and start having the same kind of discussion you're having with your executive team at your own company. But the difference is when you're governing, you're overseeing management who is running the company. You're not there to run the company yourself. Now, how do you learn that? Because it's a nuanced thing and it's a bit of an experience thing. And I'll tell you what happens in the S&P 1500 is they don't devote enough attention to that. And then they're highly critical when a new director comes up for renomination. They'll say, they just have become such a pain. They're always down in the weeds. So what do you do about that? Now, there's a bunch of law firms that will tell you, here's our definition of governance and management. Let's hand that out. That's the biggest waste of time there is. And then you have these cutesy little nose in, fingers out type of definitions, right? No one, that's not exactly a bright line test. You're into some pretty complex discussions. Where is the nose and where is the fingers, right? The best tool I've ever seen is a board buddy program. Now, I don't know how common that is in the nonprofit space.
Very.
Yeah. And what I noticed is about 5 years ago, Board Buddy sort of began as a way for the incumbent to tell the newbie about some of the history and the politics of some of these agenda items, which in itself is a really good thing. But about 5 years ago, I started to notice that new directors who'd never been on a board before were using their buddy to sort of test out some of their questions. So they would have, and nowadays you'd have a Zoom or they would have a call or meeting sort of after the board materials came out, but maybe like the day before the meeting. And the newbie would say, I'm thinking of asking this question. And the incumbent would say, that's a great question. Totally a governance level, awesome question. Then they might ask another question. And the more experienced director could say, you know what, you're a little down in the weeds. Let's get to what you're trying to get at. Okay, can we frame it like this? Or they might say, you know what, don't even go there. My experience is it takes about 4 of those meetings. And the new director, these are really smart people. They have mastered the line after about 4 or 5 of those. And what I love about that is that you're getting real in-time feedback from one of your peers. And also, once you build that skill set, you have that for the rest of your life. You really understand that line.
So I was actually next going to ask you about the board staff line. So I love that you brought it up without me having to even ask. As a board matcher, we find when a match fails, one of the biggest reasons it fails is because the candidate did not understand the board staff line. And I love what you said about having a board buddy, because while more and more nonprofit boards are setting a board buddy program in place, they haven't been clear in the way that you just were. It's the responsibility of the board buddy to coach on that board staff line, because it's very different for each organization. So you may have already sat on another nonprofit board and you understand very clearly for that nonprofit board where the board staff line is, but it's different for this organization. Such an insightful comment that you made of it is different for every organization where that board staff line is. For a smaller organization, you often have the board crossing that board staff line more than you would with a like $500 million a year nonprofit. But the idea that the board buddy has to understand that they are responsible for coaching on that particular issue among other issues, I think that's genius.
Well, I started to notice it just sort of happened organically. And the other thing too is, even if you go on a board and they don't have a board buddy program, if this is your first board, ask for one. Ask the chair of the nominating governance committee if they'll do that for you. Ask if someone on the committee will do that. Like, just because they don't have it, it doesn't mean you can't ask for it. And there is absolutely nothing wrong with asking for a little bit of help. It's far better to get that kind of support early on, master that governance management line in your first year and never look back, as opposed to, I've seen it in the S&P 1500. I mean, there was this great rush to bring younger directors out of the Silicon Valley onto boards, and then they criticized them. Oh, they're all down in the weeds. They're driving our management team nuts. They didn't give them that kind of support and an infrastructure to teach them that line.
Well, and I would also say, and this is always a theme with me at BoardAssist, we're very proud and pleased when we serve every year to see how our placements are performing. The number is usually between like 93 and 95% of our placements are serving as leaders within 12 months of being placed. So my message to you on this point that Bev brings up is, if you join a board and they don't have a board buddy program, you can raise your hand and say, hey, not only am I going to start the orientation program, can I start a board buddy program? You take it a step further, be the one who starts it. It's a really great best practice. Bev could not be more right that it's just so effective. Okay, so
Bev, can I just bring on one other point that you made? So in the book, there's a chapter on what I call the 5 board archetypes. Now, that's sort of consultant speak, but every board is a little bit different. Most, however, fall into these, what I'll call 5 board archetypes. Okay. And it's you sort of alluded to that when you said the board of the Metropolitan Museum of Art, for example, is going to operate very differently than a small local charity. Now, you look at those archetypes, they were designed obviously for the for-profit world, but I guarantee you're going to recognize the board. And when you have smaller organizations, it's no different than a startup in, the biotech corridor out of Boston or the Valley. They operate very differently. In fact, that board is more hands-on. They almost are micromanaging all the time. And that's one of the challenges often for people that start off in nonprofit service and then migrate to the S&P 1500, because they're like, oh, I've been on a board before, but they may have been on a board that was operating in a different mode when it came to the governance management line. And so it's still a learning curve for them when they translate over to the public company sector.
That's such an important point. So before I answer my next question, I just, as I see people joining us who've joined a little bit late, I just want to say, you have the Q&A feature at the bottom, the middle bottom of your screen. Bev loves questions, so if anyone has questions, she's going to take them at the end, but I know like you may not be able to stay on the entire time. So know that I will be looking at questions, and if anybody wants to feed Bev a question, please feel free to put it in the Q&A. Don't put it in the chat or raise hand function. The best place to put it is in the Q&A function. All right, so Beth, let's say I'm not a new director. I've been serving on a board for some time. What are some of the things I need to focus on to stay at the top of my boardroom game?
Well, I'll call out, I think, 3 of them. So the first is, and it's not a sexy thing, but it really is the foundation. It's work ethic, everybody knows who puts in the work, who takes the time and carefully reviews the board materials, as opposed to the person that's reading it, in the limo or on the plane on the way to the meeting, right? And it's very evident. It's also evident who makes the effort to keep up to date with what's going on. And even in the nonprofit sector, looking at what's going on in the nonprofit world, look at what's going on in fundraising, look at what's going on in the sector, whether that's museums, universities, charities, whatever it is, okay? It is very evident who's putting in the work and who's not. The second thing I would say is pick your spots in the meetings. One of the biggest rookie mistakes is somebody gets on the board, they think they got to weigh in on everything. You don't. When you prep, you want to look at where are the areas where you think you've got a really important point to make. What you don't want to be is one of these, what I'll call directors that are just add on. They just add on, oh, I agree with you. I agree with you. They're not really adding a lot of value. You want to bring a fresh perspective. That's what really gets people to go, wow. And that's what really, I think, has impact. So, if you've got a point and two people have already made it, let it go, drive on, pick your spots, determine where you want to make your points and let it go so that you're not just one of these add-on directors. And then the last thing is, I would call it the art of learning to ask the toughest question in the nicest way. You listen, some of these people think they're tough questioners. I'm a tough questioner. Well, they sound like they're cross-examining Hermann Goering at the Nuremberg trials, okay? When they're asking some poor person, gee, we thought our budget was going to go down, And when you're very aggressive in your questioning, the management person gets super defensive. And they're not thinking about that. They're just thinking about fleeing the conversation. You're not having the type of open dialogue and getting the issues out that as a board member is what you really want. And this would come up time and again in these thousands of interviews when they would say, well, our best director is so-and-so. And you go, what makes that person so good? And they can ask the toughest questions in the nicest way.
So interesting. I'm also looking at the participants coming in and I see several board chairs. And so I love what you said about being a boardroom star is about coming to the meeting prepared, because I want to highlight again, often we will speak to a board chair and they'll tell us, oh, my board members are not engaged. And your board members can't be engaged or become boardroom stars if you don't provide them the materials for the meeting ahead of time. Okay, so that's sometimes it's on you. It's, you really need to follow the best practice of providing the materials that are needed to review for the meeting at least a week in advance, so that you can give your board members a chance to be the boardroom stars that they want to be. So that's kind of bad on you if you didn't give them that opportunity. And then Bev is so right. It's bad on the board member if you had a week to review the material. And not only it's not even that you're reading it in the car on the way to the meeting, you're reading it for the first time in the meeting, and it's very clear to everyone. And people will notice, and they won't take you seriously when you have something of value you want to move forward. But what are some of the biggest pitfalls or watch-outs that directors need to avoid?
Well, there's an entire chapter with 10 of those laid out in the book. So just in the interest of time, I'll talk about kind of 3 of them. So one is grandstanding. People that sort of need to show everybody on the board how smart they are. And, nobody will criticize a director who just is really smart and asks good questions, makes good comments. But this sort of self-aggrandizement, look at me, show off thing, that comes up in nearly every director evaluation. There's somebody on the board who does that. And I'll tell you what's really interesting. It's often one of the less well-qualified directors. And many people attribute that to insecurity. It's almost like this person has to grandstand to demonstrate to the rest of the board, I belong here. I have a place at the table. But it is detracting from their credibility rather than enhancing it. So I would say that's certainly a big one. Another one is what I'll call taking the board down rabbit holes. So there's this item on the agenda. Okay, you got to figure out whether you're going to do something with this budget or whether you're going to move your headquarters, what it's going to be. And somebody brings in some way out in left field topic. And look, that happens all the time, but there are some people that do this at almost every meeting. And board time is very precious. You know, you don't get your directors together all the time. And you want to make good use of it. And while it may lead to a really interesting to and fro conversation, people eventually get annoyed because they're like, look, folks, we only have 10 minutes to talk about the new headquarters, you know, because we've been talking about whatever it is. So I think that's another one. And then the last one is, you know, very often you'll face a decision where you feel very strongly about the decision. You'll make your point and the board doesn't go your way. They vote in a different direction than the direction you would have taken. Now, you have only two choices when that happens. If you really feel strongly about this, you can't live with that, then you need to resign from the board. But if you don't feel that strongly about it, if you say, look, you know, yeah, I feel strongly, but it's not like I'm going to die on my sword, then your only choice is to support that decision. The biggest mistake is to continually bring it up. This was a mistake. They're trying, because what you're doing is you're undercutting the board's decision. And it's impacting the credibility of the board. It looks like there's a lot of disharmony on the board to the management team and to others. You know, governance is a team sport. And if you've made your case, but it's gone a different way, you only have two choices. One is to resign if it's a really big deal. And the second is to support the board's decision.
So I'm so happy you said that because I couldn't agree with that more. And, you know, we do see that happen occasionally. And, you know, at that point, we tell people you really need to resign if you can't make your peace with this. I forgot because there was so much good stuff in the book. Did you talk about the situation where with the board member who's constantly bringing up things that aren't on the agenda and kind of embarrassing the executive director by not ahead of time? They want to look like a board star, so they bring something up, but it really, it's not a nice thing to do to the executive director to just bring something that you didn't ahead of time tell him or her about.
Yeah. And what inevitably happens, it is a section of the book. It's called Waiting to Drop a Boardroom Bombshell.
Okay? I totally forgot that.
A lot of fun. And it's a related issue to grandstanding. Okay. Right. Something comes up and you say, oh, wow, I can make a big scene about this in the board meeting. It's going to be very dramatic. I'll tell you what always happens. The executive director says, why didn't you call me? Right. And most of the board agrees with that. And if you're on a board and you say to your executive team, look, we don't want to be surprised. Okay. We don't want to read in the New York Times or, you know, wherever about some problem. Well, you have an obligation not to surprise management. Right. And, you know, a real boardroom star will go to management and say, listen, I've got a big problem with this. Now, it may stay on the agenda, whatever, but they've told the executive director or the CEO, and I think that's a far better place to be. So it seems like a lot of fun to drop a boardroom bombshell. It's going to be a lot of dramatic moments, but it nearly always has blowback for the person who does it.
Completely. And I'm so sorry I didn't remember that you covered that because it is such an important point. And, you know, and we often also see sort of the corollary of that of you didn't have this bombshell until you went to the meeting. Everyone's talking about something. And now you realize, well, I have this bombshell that is going to make me look really great. But the executive director isn't going to be prepared for that. So you have to make a decision. You know what, maybe I'll just bring that up after the meeting private with the executive director and not embarrass him or her in front of everyone. Even though I might think that's going to make me look so great. It's not going to make you look like a team player. It's not the rest of the team is not going to respect that when you throw the executive director under the bus.
And Cynthia, I think it also goes to the advanced preparation for the meeting. You know, if you've got the materials a week in advance, and okay, maybe you haven't read them that day, but you've read them at least 3 or 4 days before the meeting, you can call the executive director. If you're reading them in the car on the way to the meeting, you're like, holy smokes. And then you're in a real difficult situation. Do I bring it up or do I talk to the guy after? What am I going to do? And it, I think, reinforces the value of advanced preparation.
So you talk about courage in another chapter. In fact, you devoted an entire chapter to the subject of courage. How do issues most often arise in the boardroom where courage is really required?
Well, it's very rare that, there is one of these really dramatic boardroom moments. It's often very nuanced in terms of when courage is required, right? It can be as simple as going against the grain, and it can happen at any stage in your boardroom career. So in the book, I use these are actual examples. And it's really funny because I'm just talking to a reporter at Agenda, which is a board magazine here. And that's her favorite chapter. And she wants to do an excerpt, I think tomorrow, about of one of those anecdotes and it seems to be everybody's favorite chapter. But one example is a brand new director. Okay, he comes out of a tech company. He's the young sort of hip star that they brought on the board. They've recruited him. They've told him, look, we want you to bring new ideas. And he realizes that the norms on the board is that there's these two CEOs, very high powered, and they nearly always agree with each other. And once they form an opinion, the rest of the board hardly ever challenges them. And then a tech issue comes up. And these two decide, yeah, it's a really bad idea. It's a kooky idea. This company should stick to its knitting. And he knows that it's worth exploring. And so it may not sound like a big deal, but it took courage for him as the newbie at the board table and the young guy to stand up and very graciously say, you guys brought me on the board to offer a different perspective. I'd like to do so. I want you to hear me out. And it ended up changing the whole dimension of the meeting. So it's a small thing, but it took courage. Often if you're the chair of a board committee, and I use two examples in there, one is a compensation committee chair who holds the line on CEO compensation. The other is a nominating governance committee chair who actively manages director performance and gets rid of some people that frankly haven't been contributing. That takes courage. In fact, that is the number one problem in corporate governance today, is poor performance management of directors. And there's lots of data. The PwC numbers have been unchanged for 2 years. 700 public company directors across the United States. Do you think that at least one of your fellow directors should be replaced? 49% say yes. That's half the boards in America. Okay. So this is a problem. Now, and again, stepping up to that takes courage.
You keep answering questions that I'm just about to ask. I was just about to ask, you have a whole chapter on director performance management, essentially how to handle problem directors. This is a real problem. You gave us that statistic.
Yeah.
In the nonprofit world, it's even a little bit stickier because you might have a director that's not performing, but they're a very good donor.
Yeah.
And so now it's a little bit more complicated because they're adding tremendous financial value, but one bad apple in the group can really disrupt the entire board, waste everyone's time, and be very counterproductive. So it's not without a cost that you keep somebody on who's a big donor, but is being disruptive. The new Director 360 sounds
before we get to new Director 360, I love the new Director 360. I want to talk about that. So don't get me wrong, but just to go back to the Director Performance Management, there are 4 tools that I think every board chair, whether you are in the S&P 1500, whether you are in the nonprofit, there are 4 tools you should know about. One of them is the new Director 360. We'll talk about that in a minute. You should develop some expectations for the people on your board. And just cobbling those down and circulating them around, that's not going to do much. You want to get everybody engaged around that so there's some buy-in. And then you can use that actually for performance management going forward. But you'll also find that just from engaging people, what do I mean by that? Have a video conference with everybody on your board, one-on-one, and say, look, if we were going to say, what do you expect of the people on our board? Right? They're going to say, well, I expect that they're prepared. These people here that aren't prepared. I expect that, if they've got a problem, they tell the CEO in advance. And so you create these expectations from these conversations. People have turned their mind to the issue. And so they buy in, and it's not at all uncommon for all of a sudden people who weren't prepared to suddenly be preparing, and people who were dropping boardroom bombshells to be calling the executive director. So that is one tool. Another tool is the director evaluation. And most people do that in a very perfunctory and unhelpful way. In fact, it tends to get people more mad than be useful. This sort of scoring, in my opinion, for individual feedback is completely useless. It just gets people angry. It doesn't reinforce what they're doing well, and it doesn't give them the kind of actionable feedback they really need. So you want to have discussions about that, and you want them to be structured as opposed to gossipy, and have a really good process. And when you do that, that's actually not only addressing your problems, it's also reinforcing and polishing your boardroom stars, because they're understanding the value that their peers see them as bringing to the board table. And, so I think that those are some tools that are really important. And then we'll talk about the new Director 360, because it's quite exciting. And
well, yes. So let's talk about that. Let's talk. It sounds really interesting. Tell us more.
Okay, so about 2 years ago, I was hired by a Fortune 100 board, and they had a really high-powered board, and they had these two really high-powered new directors, and they'd been on the board for like 12 and 18 months each, and they had a lot of Fortune 100 experience. And they said, frankly, we do a director evaluation before someone gets renominated. They're both up for renomination, and we just can't do this like tick the box thing. We want something real. So I did confidential interviews with everybody on the board, everybody on the senior management team, and even like their external auditors, because one of them served on the audit committee, their comp consultants, another one served on the comp committee. And in the book, you'll see, and if you're really interested in this, just go on my website, which is boardadvisor.net, and you'll see it's called the New Director 360. You can see a sample of what that report looks like. It is incredibly detailed, actionable. If you've got a problem, it's going to nip it in the bud. It's so much easier to do that with someone who's been on the board for 12 months than after the pattern's been established. It reinforces what they're doing well. And I also built in a developmental component. So in the interviews, I asked people, look, if you were going to give, say, Randy some advice as to continue his learning about the company, Randy needs to go to this convention in Las Vegas, and let me tell you why, and all this. Or they're like, Randy needs to go and see the shipping bay in Los Angeles. And so it has both an evaluative and a developmental component, and there's absolutely no reason you couldn't adapt that in some form to the nonprofit world.
So that's so great. Now, the book is coming out next week. When can folks get a copy? If they're interested, tell us more about that.
So thank you so much. I will show you that.
Very exciting. Very exciting.
I have an advanced copy. So this is the new book, Becoming a Boardroom Star. You can pre-order it on Kindle ebook now. The paperback, hopefully we will be loading early next week. It will launch on the 30th, so 1 week from today, both paperback and an ebook. And also I just finished the audiobook, so we're going to have that in Audible as well. I think it takes a little longer to get that loaded, but it's coming out very soon, so you can pre-order it now, or you can pick it up when it comes out a week from now.
That is great. And then you were also never one to rest. You were also working on some other books during COVID. So what else do you have in the works?
Yeah, so the first book that came out, we actually launched this one about 5 weeks ago, as you mentioned. This is Board and Director Evaluations. It debuted as #1 in Amazon, new release in corporate governance. So it already has nearly 50 reviews on Amazon, and they're all 4 and 5 star, which is great. But it's a really practical book about board and director evaluations, because in most cases that's a squandered opportunity. And it's just lays out a lot of really innovative ideas, because that's sort of the core of my work over the last 25 years. And then the last book that's coming out is a book for new CEOs. It's called New CEOs and Boards. And one of the most challenging things for a new CEO is when they're managing up, they're not managing a boss anymore, they're managing a group. And that's true for an executive director, it's true for a CEO. And that is a really difficult transition, a lot more than you would think. And learning to work with a board is something I get asked about a lot. So most of the time my clients are boards, but increasingly I was having CEOs or the board asking me to work with the CEO. So this book is specifically for new CEOs about starting off while working with their board.
That what you're going to keep us very, very busy this fall. So we so appreciate that. I'm not seeing any questions. What I am seeing that makes me very happy and which will make you laugh is as I'm looking at the names of the people who I can see are participating with us today, it is the boardroom stars I know. What a surprise that the people I know who are the best board members are the ones who made the time to tune in today. They're not watching the recording. They made an effort to be here live so they could ask questions if they had any. And isn't it always that way that
Well, it really is. And this is one of the things I said to emphasize in the book is that one of the hallmarks of a boardroom star is continuous improvement. That's really a boardroom champion, actually, is someone who is constantly looking for ways not only to improve themselves, but to improve their board, their committee, whatever it is. That is really a hallmark. And so it's not at all unusual that would be the audience. And
I mean, I'm not going to call out anybody but by name, but I see somebody that we placed on a museum board who became the board chair within 6 months of joining that board, for example.
awesome.
These are boardroom stars. There are going to be triple boardroom stars now that we got to hear from you for 40 minutes today. So we really, really appreciate your time. I know that you're just going to create this entire domino effect in the nonprofit world with all the great advice you gave us here today. So we're very, very grateful for it. And we're all excited to go read all those books. You're going to keep us very busy this fall. So Bev, thank you so much for being with us today. We really appreciate it. And thank you to everybody who tuned in today.
Yeah, thank you, Cynthia. It was a real pleasure. And thanks to everybody. I hope I gave you some constructive ideas.
Definitely. Thanks so much. Enjoy the rest of your day.